You're listening to the Trailblazers podcast, episode 70 with Lauren Bealore.
You're listening to the Trailblazers podcast, where we will explore the stories of successful Black professionals. Join us as we highlight the knowledge, resources, and tools of these accomplished trailblazers to help provide the know-how, confidence, and motivation you need to blaze your trail. And now, here's your host, Stephen Hart.
Hello and welcome to the Trailblazers podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Hart. In today's episode, I talk with Lauren Bealore. She's a young 27-year-old trailblazer that's paving a new pathway for women in Michigan in the world of politics and business. Back in 2014, Lauren was the only millennial African-American woman in Michigan that worked in the fundraising realm of politics, and she thrived. She helped raise hundreds of thousands of dollars in funding for campaign elections. Today, she's the corporate relations and events manager for the Michigan League of Conservation Voters, and she's taking her fundraising efforts to the environmental policy area of politics. Out of all 29 state leagues nationally, Lauren is the first and only African-American in this role. She's also the co-founder for a woman-owned nonprofit organization by the name of YAB, which stands for Young, Ambitious, and Beautiful. It's a young entrepreneurial conglomerate for businesses owned by women of color. So in today's interview, we discussed the shifts that are happening that seem to be stifling the voice of Black women in politics. We also talked about the impact that race, gender, and ethnicity might play in politics as we look out maybe a decade from now. Before we get into my conversation with Lauren, I wanted to give a shout out to one of our listeners, Boston H 2014, who left us a really awesome review over on iTunes that read, "One of my favorite podcasts, engaging host, great content, guests, and advice. I look forward to each week. Thank you." Well, thank you so much for the very kind comment and rating, Boston H 2014. Listen, guys, if you're focused on becoming a trailblazer in your home, in your work, and community, then we'd like to welcome you to our Trailblazer family. As a trailblazer yourself, please help us to get the word out to more future trailblazers by logging into iTunes right now and leaving a quick rating and comment for the podcast. Doing that helps the Trailblazer community as a whole to grow and become noticed by others who want to join this movement. Just a reminder that you've got the full show notes for today's episode that's up right now. You can just click on over to tbpod.com/episode 70. That said, let's get to receive some mission fuel from today's Trailblazer, Lauren Bealore. Hope you enjoy. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Lauren, welcome, and thanks for being our featured Trailblazer today.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephen.
So your bio and your accomplishments kind of blow me away. For a young woman at, 27? I'm pretty surprised right now, kind of just reading your profile. And I would probably be surprised if I don't see you published on Forbes 30 here before your opportunity runs out.
Let's speak it into existence.
Amen.
Stephen. Let's speak it into existence. Okay. You're blessing my life right now.
Were you always this ambitious and driven as a kid?
You know what? I feel like the humility in me would love to say no and give you like a cliche story of how I changed the path. But no, this has really been me since 1989, straight out the womb. I kind of always had, and I think it comes from being an only child, because you have a lot of time on your hands to think. And, I spent a lot of time mapping out my life as far as knowing that I wanted to have a successful route, knowing that I wanted to use my voice. I didn't necessarily know what direction I wanted to utilize that voice, or what community that I wanted to represent, or, what leadership roles I exactly wanted to take, but I knew that I wanted to take them.
So there wasn't like a particular dream that you had, like, when I grow up, I'm going to be...
Oh, well, definitely. I mean, I initially actually, and I don't think anyone knows this, so you're the first, outside of my parents, but I actually wanted to be a fashion designer.
Really?
I was really, really into fashion. I truly get that from my mother. But in elementary school was wearing like Donna Karen, who was really big,
What?
and Banana Republic, and like, I mean, people wear that as an adult, but I thought you wore that as a child. So, in the 6th grade, I did my report for a Spanish class on Carolina Herrera, and the teacher was like, how do you even know who this is? Because most people chose Selena, but I'm like, no, she's a Spanish descent representation in the fashion industry,
Right.
and she's amazing and really should go truly noted. So, that was really my initial goal. And then that eventually transitioned into wanting to be an attorney, which I think many, many young Black boys and girls have that same dream.
Right.
And of course, a lot of it comes to fruition for many of them. But that was kind of my initial goal. A lot of times you'll have, of course, certain roadmaps in the Black community of careers to take, whether that be doctor, lawyer, teacher, engineer, nurse. We have like those top 5 careers. So politics definitely was not on the radar because the representation wasn't necessarily there, unless it was to say, well, possibly run for office, which even then that came across more as a hobby than a career. So that really wasn't necessarily able to be in the forefront for me because it wasn't necessarily encouraged, which is something I try to do every day of my career to generations coming behind me. So,
in the Caribbean, every parent wants their child to be a doctor or a lawyer.
It doesn't change. We're all one and the same.
How did your family help to kind of shape you?
Well,
you mentioned your mom a minute ago.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love my parents. Both are super ambitious individuals themselves. My mother has a career in banking, business banking at that, and there's not many people of color in that particular realm. And then my father is actually an engineer.
Wow.
And he also was chief in the military, which is the highest ranking you can go. So they kind of set the bar pretty high,
right,
on what I should engage in professionally as well. But I would say how they shaped me, I would say it's not just from a career standpoint or an ambition standpoint. It's from a moral standpoint and a character standpoint. I think, instilling in me that I should never back down to anyone in order to let them succeed, which that's kind of where this saying that I created came from, of never dull your diamonds to let rock shine. My parents never taught me to be second best. It's like, if you choose to go for something, then you're going to give it 110%. You're not just going to half shoot for it. And so I think instilling that at such a young age, and it's funny because I give this story. There's 2 stories. One being that when I was younger, I think someone must have messed with me when I was like 7 and I came home crying, and, most parents were like, oh, it'll be okay. And my mom, of course, as a Black mother at that, was like, if you come home crying ever again, I'm going to whoop you. And I think it's such an interesting story because it made me, granted, it seems like, wow, okay, that's pretty tough, but it actually made me a very tough person. And from that day forward, I never let anyone put their hands on me or disrespect me in any kind of way. And then the other story actually is that my parents definitely always taught me to kind of be very vocal. And, I started out, it was the 90s, and I started out in a school that was predominantly white when I was in preschool. And I was kind of left off by myself because no one really wanted to hang out with you. We weren't like assimilated or for the culture like it is today. But it was interesting because I guess one day I came home and I changed the tone of my voice. And so, I was asking my dad, I was like, Dad, where's Mom? And he was like, I don't know who child I picked up, but why are you changing your voice? And so, they kind of had to sit me down and basically say, 1, we're taking you out of the school. And 2, you should never feel that you have to assimilate, to be able to fit into a social structure or a social environment. And so that's also something that has stuck with me. And so when you have, people grounding you foundationally to be very thick-skinned, very tough, but then also too, making sure that you represent from the demographics that make up who you are. I think that's contributed to me wanting to be a great representation for women, but also for African Americans as well. And I think that's played out in my career and having this drive to always want to be the first to do something when it comes to being a woman or being Black. And I think those things stick with you as children. But then there are also negative side effects of people who are Black or women who didn't have that type of positive force letting them know that it was okay to be who you are. So I think that's definitely helped to shape who I am. And I think both of those stories kind of can tell you why I ended up the person I am today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's odd that you hear young Black women that have aspirations to jump into that world of politics. Were there any other people, any other mentors or coaches early on, maybe not as a kid, but in college or shortly after, that helped to guide you?
I mean, I definitely think there were influences that helped to catapult my career.
Yeah.
My first opportunity that I was given in politics as far as on a high level, so federal level, was given to me by a Black guy that was running for Congress. He was state rep at the time. We're actually really good friends to this day. And he's actually, now part of the board of our organization that I work for. So our relationship has come full circle of support, because now we're able to support one another and each other's endeavors. But if it weren't for him, I probably would not be where I am today. Because, he specifically wanted a Black woman in the role of assistant finance director for his campaign. Now, many people do not specifically look to put a person of color, especially a woman of color, in finance roles in politics, which is why you do not see many Black female fundraisers for either, whether it's in campaigns or in the lobbying realm of politics. And many times, you definitely don't see them as campaign managers. So you either see them as a candidate with not much support or resources or anyone to help them fundraise, which they still need a fundraiser, or you kind of see them as a staffer. And it's disheartening, because it's not to say that those roles don't mean anything, because every single role of politics means something. However, if you're not encouraging them to take on different roles, then the idea of where they can see their career go as far as representation comes into play is limited and it's skewed. And so for him to, see that, and I had never done fundraising on campaigns, by the way. So, wow. To be put on a federal level and then in that first year, to help raise like $500,000 and you're like collecting like $20,000 a day, I just had never seen that side of things. And so it was very interesting. It was very stressful, but that took a lot of faith in him. So many times, I always let him know if I have any accomplishments that have come after. He's definitely the first person to know, because you helped me get to this point. So I kind of owe you that,
Right. So have you seen more women of color take roles in that campaign fundraising sphere since?
Stephen, this is going to be really sad to tell you no.
Wow. So what can be done to kind of encourage that?
Oh, there's a lot that can be done. One, so there are programs in place that are supporting women of color in politics, more so becoming candidates. So you have like Higher Heights based out of New York, which supports women of color, specifically Black women in politics. And then you have Emerge Michigan, Emily's List, and Vote Run Lead that support women candidates in general. There's actually no program that I know of existence in politics that specifically is looking to get women of color in roles, whether it be on campaigns or whether it be in the lobbying realm, opportunities in fundraising. As far as women in Michigan, outside of myself, I do know one other fundraiser who has also been very supportive to me in my career. and she is an amazing fundraiser. But outside of us two, can't really name any others that are women of color that have a successful track of fundraising, who've kind of made it to the point where you have a lot of people demanding you to be their fundraiser or consult on their campaign.
Right. So it's great that you're a trailblazer, but, it's not even a case that they're hidden figures. They're no figures. I mean, that's something that we definitely want to see change, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it was interesting because I had a friend ask me about needing a fundraiser recently for a campaign. And sadly, I couldn't give him anyone. And so one thing I told him, I was like, it's time for you guys to just take a chance on someone. I was like, someone took a chance on me. So you're going to have to go out there and you're going to have to seek that potential that you want. Because if there are no programs in place to give these people these opportunities, you have to create those people.
Right.
So that the opportunities are there. Someone created that wheelhouse for me. The other Black female fundraiser that I know, someone created the opportunity for her. She wasn't even working in politics. So you have to create these wheelhouses for women of color because there are no wheelhouses for that to be their cultivated talent. So that's, I think, where we're kind of at when it comes to women in politics as far as taking on the less saturated roles.
Right. We've seen so many powerful Black women at the top, right, in media and politics that have gotten shown the door, right? Tamron Hall, Melissa Harris Perry, even issues we're seeing recently with Congresswoman Maxine Waters, right? Auntie Maxine. Why do you think there are so many shifts recently to stifle the voice of our Black women in politics?
So there's a couple of ways that we can address this. One, we can look at it from the point of intersectionality, meaning that with Black women representing both women and the Black community, it's very difficult because they're constantly told to be a representative for both communities where they are also secondarily marginalized. So in the Black community, they're secondary marginalized because Black men are supposed to be the head honchos in that community. And then you have in the female community, they're secondarily marginalized because white women are supposed to be the head honchos in that category. And so it's very difficult because it's historically embedded for us to never have a voice in either community that we both are supposed to be representing. That's one. I think also two, the reason why you probably see the recent shift, although it's always been there, but the reason why you're probably seeing these women's voices be stifled, I won't say it's because of our new leadership on the federal level, because they would have done that regardless of who was there. It just was probably a little more difficult to do that under President Obama with Michelle there as well. Right. That wasn't really going to fly. But I think we're seeing it because we also are seeing these women want to stop the shenanigans. Tamron Hall and Melissa Harris Perry, I can definitely say, we're tired of delivering content based on some platform that a white man gave them. Mm-hmm. And you kind of see the same thing, when you look at white female anchors that are placed on, let's say, Fox News. You see that they finally want to have an alternative voice. And if it doesn't fit into the scope of that news outlet, then we're done with you. We've had enough. You've played your role. And so I think a lot of these Black women that are doing political correspondence or who are pundits are probably tired of being the puppet to the master, so to speak, where they're not able to really deliver political education. They're just kind of delivering news. And it's news based on the foundation of what someone else has given them. Yeah. And I could see that being difficult. I mean, I definitely would not want to take an opportunity to basically lessen what I feel is vital or imperative for communities to know that are disadvantaged. Yeah. And I think that that's kind of what we're seeing here. I think, well, first of all, Congresswoman Maxine Waters has always been this way. She was the same Congresswoman being vocal during the Rodney King beatings as she was today. I think the difference is we have social media, and now people can just see that she's been the auntie. She always will be the auntie. And there have been several others that need to be heralded as well. It's just that, we're so used to heralding the Hillary Clintons or the Nancy Pelosi's or, even Elizabeth Warren, that,
Right.
A lot of the Black legislators just get pushed to the back. And so it's nice to see her get her shine. It's well-deserved. And she should not drop her mic until she's ready to.
Yeah. You have to think that this is probably the last good run for an administration like we have today, right? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on maybe what you think the next decade looks like, right? From when we look at race, gender, and ethnicity and the impact of that in the political scene.
So I'm going to give it to you from a positive view, and then I'm going to play devil's advocate to that. I'm not going to say a negative view, because I'm choose not to be negative, but I'm going to give you the devil's advocate of that. So from a positive view, we do have progress. We do have diverse electeds that were not there before, representing, different race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, different communities and voices that we did not have prior to, that are now able to be the voices for their individual districts, whether that be on the local, state, or federal level, and can help push policies that maybe someone didn't think about. And the reason I'm going to give that as an example is that a board that I was on, the Emerging Leaders Board, through a publication called Metro Mode that worked on solutions journalism. I mean, this is probably the most diverse group of people that I've ever been in a cluster, a cohort with. And in addition to difference in race, ethnicity, and gender, we had, for instance, one person was transgender, and I had never, I've never even socialized with someone that was transgender. And I feel like for us to be working on solutions journalism, to have that voice at the table was extremely important, because there are things that they would think about that I wouldn't.
Right.
And the same thing with having someone on our board that was from the Mexican community, and she's a strong voice for the Mexican community. And, we were picking topics to work on the solutions journalism, and she mentioned immigration. I'm going to be honest, I would not think about immigration first. I'm, of course, going to go for things that affect my community or the demographic that I represent. Right. So, obviously, I'm going to look at civic engagement and social justice and welfare issues, and of course, women's rights, urban sprawl, things that I feel that affect communities. Right. Exactly. And so that is something that's extremely important, because it was a wake-up call, not a wake-up call for me, because it's of existence, but until you are in a room that's extremely diverse, you don't realize how much you are neglecting other communities by not proactively thinking about, policies that might benefit the growth of their community. And so that's what happens every day in politics. If you don't have these voices at the table, then of course they're not thinking about them. Why would they? And it's probably subconscious. Some of it is conscious. So that is where I would say the positive is that we are having these different voices and leaders emerge, especially after the election. Now, devil's advocate to that would be the fact that we have a lot of voices at the table, but they're misguided. And I'm going to take it back to a classic film that I like called Schoolhouse Rock. And, how we had our good friend Bill, who's just a Bill sitting on Capitol Hill, not having that foundation of how politics work from the legislative, executive, and judicial branches is extremely imperative. People don't take social studies serious anymore when you look at education, which is a whole other conversation. But there are a lot of people who actually literally don't know how politics works. And it really came out when people actually had to pay attention to Electoral College this year, because we just haven't in, over a decade have to pay attention to that. I mean, not since the Bush-Gore election, which was about, if we're looking back at like 2001, I mean, I was like 11. Yeah. But of course, I was paying attention because that was important to me even at that time. And so it's really interesting that we have this time span where different avenues of politics have not really been put in the forefront, which means that, when you have people not learn the voting process until they're 18, that's a lot of time to give people to just start learning. It's like learning a foreign language.
Right.
And so I find it very, very complex and a little disheartening about where we're going to go in the future, because if you have misguided or I'll say not uneducated, miseducated individuals running for office, that's just as bad as having people who are just horrible run for office. So,
Yes.
I'm very concerned about where that's going to go in the future.
It's interesting you said that, and I'm thinking about the comment you had made before. I'm an immigrant myself, so there's so much that I've lived in this country since 1993, right? But there's still so much I'm in the dark about having lived here and not quite understanding, because there's really no awareness or program to kind of help me, right? Most of it was probably embedded in school, which by the time I got here, I went to college. I find it interesting that you have so much immigrants in this country, right, that probably don't know, that have, like me, lived here, their adult lives. What kind of programs are there, or what kind of programs can we create to educate that base of people like me, right, about the political system? Because we have a big voice and it continues to grow, right? You have a large portion of population as Hispanics, right? When we're talking about a decade out from now, that are going to have a voice that, to your point, if we don't educate that base, could be harmful, playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to see more done in that regard. There's so much that I'm learning by way of a 7-year-old kid, right now that I just never knew before. And there's just, it's a lack of awareness on that side. And I'm partly to blame.
No, well, I definitely think that there's room to grow. I don't think that you're necessarily to blame because you moved to a country that systematically did not necessarily want certain populations to understand politics. So it really was never created for you to understand, whether that's immigrants, minorities, or the like. Our political system is definitely socially constructed to be advantageous to a certain demographic, which is why a lot of times you see that people who have chosen to be Republican, as far as partisanship goes, it's not always really due to being a staunch conservative, so to speak. It's more so due to, we understand policy and business, and we're going to vote this way because it's the more educated way to vote.
Right.
And I've engaged with both, from working on all three levels as well as working within the lobbying realm. You're forced to be able to understand where both Democrats and Republicans are coming from.
Right.
And from getting to know both parties, I would say that, yes, Republicans definitely explain why they vote within their party a lot differently than a Democrat would explain that. And I think that's, when we look at this past election, I think partisanship played out a lot. I think that Republicans saw opportunity to capitalize on the fact that Democrats were lost and who they wanted to support, and for many different reasons. And they were able to leverage that for their party's sake. Although both parties have a huge disadvantage because both need a lot of growth to connect with millennial voters, Republicans were able to just pull together, a roadmap better for success for their party than we were necessarily able to do. Does that mean that one is better than the other? Absolutely not. But one just outsmarted the other. I think we've seen this story play out time and time again, where this same party was able to be advantageous to themselves. And I do think that it's because they look at their party more like a business, and we kind of look at it as
that's exactly it,
as a social protest. Voting is not a social protest.
As a marketer, and I'm not going to tell you that by any means I'm happy with the outcome of this last election, but as a marketer, I looked at this thing and saw someone as a businessman who understood how to look at a market and look at a pain point and push that agenda. And that's exactly what I saw Trump able to accomplish. So I don't know if there was a political roadmap as much as just that businessman in him saw a particular demographic that had a pain point and he just like went for it. And the marketer in him saw an opportunity that I think no one else politically was making sense of. They're all looking at it from that vantage point and couldn't make sense of why he was running away with a race like he did.
Well, you know what? Politics is probably one of the most traditional industries that is still around. We still knock doors, which is pretty old school. We still do mailings, which is pretty old school at this point. We still do phone banking, which is definitely pretty old school at this point. We take a lot of old school methods to reaching voters and constituent bases. And we use a lot of old school rhetoric and language as well. And what he did was he looked at this election similarly to the way that President Barack Obama looked at the election. And I'm going to put that a lot of people do not see how he basically mimicked him just in a more, it could be in a more ignorant way, but he still mimicked his exact platform. What he did was, President Barack Obama, who is beyond a genius and pretty much the GOAT when it comes to politics in my eyes. What he did back in 2008, which was my first time voting, by the way, he saw that there were demographics that were growing but not being heard. So what he did was he made sure that he built his election off of tapping into those demographics. He used consultants for the first time. A lot of people were not utilizing consultants in the way that he did. He utilized branding in a way that no one had ever seen before. Yeah, and that's the exact same thing that this current president, because I never say the name, but that's the same thing that the current president did as well. He tapped into demographics that were growing but not heard. And then he tapped into a brand. And at the end of the day, if you really look at the direction of where the country is going in, both presidents used the direction that the country is going in, and that's branding and technology. Yeah. Everywhere you look, everyone's getting into branding or technology. It's growing industries, and we can't look at politics the way we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s because we were in different industries. Like we were a completely different society. And so when you are at that time more so in corporate industries or automotive industries, and now today you're in tech industries, PR industries, branding, and it's two completely different environments. And it's very difficult when you have career politicians from 3 eras ago try to be relevant today.
Right.
Technically, President Obama was a new school, a modern version of a politician, and technically so is the current one we have. If we really want to look at it, which is why Romney didn't win, which is why Clinton didn't win, which is why McCain didn't win, because they were career politicians using old school methods. At the end of the day, this industry is still a business, whether we want it to be or not. But if it wasn't, then I wouldn't be taking home a paycheck every other week. So, it still needs innovation. And I think that's the positive, is that we have a bunch of millennials who want to see change and innovation happen in all areas of professionalism. But then the negative is that they just don't understand the foundation of these doctrines and policies that were created before them. So
Lauren, that brings me to this, right? You are an innovator, a young 27-year-old. We talked about this before. You've accomplished so much, right? And you're a co-founder today of YAB, Young, Ambitious, and Beautiful, right? But, we're talking about this, and I'm wondering, so you're helping young Black women look at entrepreneurship, but do you see a path to help young Black women pursue a path in politics as well?
There's definitely a way to merge the two.
Mm.
You know, I always say that politics and YAB for me are the most beautiful blended union of a marriage that I could have ever been blessed to have in my life.
So you're working on a mixtape?
Absolutely. The remix is already out. And so, you know, I say that to say, for me working from the fundraising side of politics, I see how business contributes to the political realm. You know, when you're working with donors and they all work for the top businesses or they own the top businesses,
Right.
you know, you already see how it plays a role. And from seeing that scope of things, I also see how many donors I work with that are not women of color. And that bothers me. So that means that I'm also, not only am I not seeing women in politics, but I'm also not seeing them in business when I still need them for politics. You see what I'm saying? And so that is the merit. I'm trying to get people to understand why I chose to have the two marry one another.
Right.
Because there's a key link there that a lot of people are not seeing. They keep thinking that both are separate. And, you know, I think it's so funny when I do a publication feature, do a podcast, and like people want to ask me about each separately, but they really complement one another because it's interesting, you know, when President Barack Obama was in office, a lot of his initiatives pushed for helping women in business, especially those that own small businesses. And he had tons of programs and initiatives that were pushing that effort, especially around 2014. He really was pushing that out under the White House. And there can be laws, policies, and initiatives from government that can support women in business. For instance, on the federal level, as well as on the state level, there are several electeds that are, of course, put on committees. You know, I don't know if many people know that, but just to break that down, I mean, a lot of times you're assigned your committees, but of course you can kind of leverage for the committees that you want. And on both levels of government, there are committees that focus on business and entrepreneurship. And so when you don't have the representation there to even know that you can receive the resources or support on that level, I'm talking millions to put towards programs and funding for women in business, how do you expect it to grow? How? How do you expect to get the money? And so it really, really irks my soul that like people do not see how all of this intertwines with one another. And when you ask like, how can I build that into a long-term career in the future? You know, I feel that it's almost my duty, but more so just imperative that, you know, I use my knowledge and my voice to make sure that women, especially women of color, are aware of these opportunities. So it's funny that you asked the question about Tamara Hall, Melissa Harris Perry, because long term, I do want to do political correspondence, but I want to do it not from a broadcast journalism perspective, because that is not what I majored in. That was not my focus during my education, both undergraduate and graduate level. It was policy. And you need people in the political media, not the general media, but I would say the more so the political media, that have worked on every level of government or worked heavily within policy, or even if they worked on a specific level of government and had, you know, a role as chief of staff or as a policy advisor or director, to be in these forums where they can actually educate people on what's going on. Because, I mean, when are we going to get to the day where we're actually going to educate people on a ballot initiative before they get to the ballot box to vote on it?
Right.
You know, when are we going to get to the day where we have forums on partnering with Google or with Microsoft and making sure that women of color receive the funding funneled through the federal level or the state level? You know, those opportunities are there. It's just that no one is connecting the dots to be that pipeline to make sure that people have these resources and opportunity. And that's because they don't know that it exists or that it's a chance to do that. And so that is ultimately where I would like to see my career go and grow. And I think both my career in politics as well as, working with YAB is going to help that come to fruition. So that was my long way around that
Yeah,
answer.
no, that's cool. That's cool. What are some of the bigger challenges you think standing in your way right now for YAB to be able to thrive with some of what you just mentioned?
I'm honestly going to say, and I feel like my co-founders would say the same thing, that there really have been no challenges. And the reason I would say that is because we honestly do this from a genuine point of view. So one, we're not trying to make money off of YAB. It's genuinely because we want to see.
And YAB is a nonprofit, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we've done for our event series is we've charged exactly $1, which everyone thinks is so weird when they actually go to register for an event. It's like I'm paying $1 with my card. That's so weird. But we've charged exactly $1, sometimes $5 for special events. But we charge that amount because every dollar is to go to our scholarship. So that way we can support women of color who are pursuing their education, specifically wanting to focus on a career in business or somewhere in that scope. And so that's kind of really the only monetary income that comes in. And it all 100% of it goes to the scholarship.
So why not charge 20 or 50? I mean, like, especially in some of these urban cities that you're in where probably some of your attendees to these events would probably still feel comfortable paying it and increase that scholarship
yes
amount.
and no.
Yeah.
So this is the thing that people don't understand about necessarily branding, because we're also in a competitive market these days where everyone's doing the same thing. Right. So it's like, come to my event for $25. We're going to network, we're going to sip and shop or whatever the case may be. Right. Come to my empowerment conference for $50. We're all going to talk about being inspired and then walk away and set some goals. And all of these things are great. They are awesome. But the most success comes from picking your own lane. And it's interesting because our very first event series that we did, the venue capacity was 250 people. And we definitely pushed it to the max where it could have been a fire hazard with 250 people. And this is 250 women on a Friday night, some in heels. I mean, all of them standing up just to listen to these panelists that we had specifically picked out. Right. And a lot of people are like, well, why don't you charge? Why don't you try to make money off of it or a profit? Because it's really not about that. Yeah. What they're going to get from attending is much greater. And so in this past year of 2016, we had 4 quarterly events and we made over $1,000, which means that if we had 250 people and we charged $1, then we made $250 per event that could go towards a scholarship. And so all of it goes towards the book scholarship for a senior in high school or a freshman in college. And so that being said, it's strategic more so to not make it about money. I just hate when people are like making it about, charging $20 here, $30 here, just because Jane Doe around the corner just did the same thing. Right. We really want it to be about, I actually did not want to charge at first until I realized that we could be supporting our scholarship in such ways. I was just like, we can just get a grant and just fund it that way. But it truly makes it more about the message and the mission when you do it from that type of scope, because I would rather work harder to get 250 attendees and have $1 per attendee than have 25 people there and you charge $25. Right. So it's more about, it has to be about the message and the mission as well. And so I think that's, working with my co-founders and us continuously supporting that mission of lifting as we climb has definitely been more beneficial or satisfactory than that charging that larger amount.
Well, keep pushing.
Thank you.
So we're losing time with you here, and I could probably keep talking to you for a good half or more, but I wanted
I'm
to ask
flattered.
a couple last questions here. As a young millennial trailblazer, what are some books that you've found yourself reading that have given you wisdom and inspiration to take some of the action that you find yourself taking right now?
So I love this question because I'm a little more old school when it comes to books. I'm very new school when it comes to documentaries, and I could name a plethora of documentaries that have inspired me. I have like a list of over 100 that I
Wow.
keep.
Where are you consuming
That I've
documentaries?
watched. It's a combination, mainly Netflix.
Yeah, I'm a
But
Netflix documentary junkie too.
But I also love Independent Lens on PBS. I just
Nice.
love PBS. I loved it as a child.
Yeah.
I fell back in love with it as an adult, which I just saw one on National Geographic? That was LA 92, revisiting the LA riots. And I had already watched a documentary on the LA riots. So sometimes I'll watch a documentary on the same subject to get two different perspectives.
Yeah.
But for books, I like a lot of the books that I read in my adolescent years. One of my favorites of all time is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Just this idea of looking at society from a different lens on how we think by choosing to burn books was just so interesting to me. And it was way ahead of its time. So completely shout out to that book. I'm also a huge Toni Morrison fan, probably to the day I die. I've read, the list is long. Sula, The Bluest Eye. Song of Solomon is my favorite. Her characters are so eccentric, and the reason that I like her books or why they inspire me is because she does not give you the stereotypical Black person. So you actually have to think of them almost as colorless because granted, they're set in these environments or with these plots that, put them in the realm of, okay, I know they're Black. Cause like I've heard that person before. I can visualize that town or, I know what they look like, but the way that they think out of the box, they almost dream. It's really interesting. And I really, really, really love her books. I would have to say I read in college that I love to this day that I can still reference, and that's Brave New World. And that was actually about how futurism and technology would eventually run society, which I think is really interesting because that's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's happened before when we moved into the Industrial Revolution and a lot of people lost jobs. I think that's going to happen again, which should be interesting because it's kind of like if you aren't working with tech, you might be lost there. And then I would have to say other books that I love. A recent one was the author of Brown is the New White. And I was at a conference for work recently, and he actually was one of our guest speakers to talk about the new democracy. Steve Phillips is the author. And we actually got a chance to speak one-on-one. So it was really interesting. It talks about how, there's a demographic revolution and how these demographics of minorities pretty much outweigh white demographics of voters, but yet we're not messaging to them. So I think that's extremely relevant. People really need to read it if they want to, know how to win in 2020. Might want to suggest that to some campaign managers there. But otherwise, I would say those are probably my top books. I mean, the list could go on, but if I can't give it to you now off the top of my head, it must have not been that memorable. So those are the ones I can actually reference.
Love it. As we get to close off this conversation, I'd love to have you share one action our trailblazers should take this week to help them blaze your trail.
I would say that one action that trailblazers should take this week is discuss your vision with yourself. Everyone may not be a spiritual person. I am. So I discuss my visions with God so it can be manifested into reality. But if that is not your choice, then discuss it with yourself And when you're saying it out loud, explain it to yourself as if you were pitching this idea to yourself to fund yourself. And I think that if some future trailblazers do that, they might actually see actionary items come from their thoughts.
Love it. Lauren, thank you so very much. I appreciate having you on. Enjoy this conversation. You opened my eyes up a bit on a couple of your points made, and I'm excited to see where life takes you. I feel like you're gonna, as you have done so well before, be creating a lot more firsts as a young Black woman. So excited to see what's next for you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Stephen. I feel like you've said, such amazing things, but I have to say that back to you. I heard about your podcast from actually listening to it first. So you keep blazing trails with the awesome things you're doing with the podcast. And I just thank you so much for having me on and letting me share my story.
Thank you, Lauren. Well, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Trailblazers podcast. I'll be posting links to all of today's book recommendations and links mentioned on our show notes page at tbpod.com. If today was your first time listening to the Trailblazers podcast, I just want to extend a warm Trailblazers welcome to you. We're so happy to have you here, and we encourage you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button in your favorite podcast app. Go ahead and browse through some of our past episodes to keep the knowledge flowing. If you're a fan of the podcast and today's content, and you're maybe already subscribed to the podcast, please continue to share and invite your friends, your family, your colleagues to listen to an episode that you think might impact them most. We believe that someone listening to these inspiring stories will be moved to make significant changes that will have generational impact for many others, both now and well into the future. Don't miss next week's episode. New episodes are released each and every Monday by about 5 a.m. Eastern. Trailblazers, jump off this podcast today. Go find a way to rise above, go way beyond, and keep blazing your trail. Cheers.